maybe you can't say this, but I'll say it. Casey versus Planned Parenthood, 1992. I've been saying for years is one of the dumbest things ever said by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Did you know that the 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in the United States are Catholic? That fact alone often surprises people, given America's long history of suspicion toward Catholic influence in public life. Within that context, one justice in particular has drawn intense attention in recent years. Her name is Amy Coney Barrett. She has been open about her Catholic faith, her moral convictions, and her previous involvement in the charismatic covenant community known as People of Praise. Because of this openness, many assumptions have been made about how her faith shapes her role on the court. It is precisely these assumptions that Justice Barrett recently addressed in a sit-down conversation with Bishop Barron, where she reflected on the overturning of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, explaining her reasoning for the decision. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Casey versus Planned Parenthood, 1992. I've been saying for years is one of the dumbest things ever said by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the one that I always cite is this famous line: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence and of the universe and the meaning of human life." That's the most extravagantly stupid definition of liberty that I've ever seen. For that reason, I'm glad it was overturned. I'll tell you philosophically what's the matter with that statement. It's an incoherent statement, and it's based upon a complete misunderstanding of what real liberty means. What's wrong with it legally? Like, how would you say there's the trouble with Casey versus Planned Parenthood?
I've heard you criticize this statement maybe a year or two ago on the podcast. I would say from a legal point of view, it gets to the same point that I was just making about what liberty is. Liberty, and the Dobbs opinion makes this point, liberty might mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And if you define it up to a very high level of generality like that, well, then what rights could I not take outside the legislative process? Because it's important for people to understand and non-lawyers to understand the effect of a decision, like, for example, Roe and Casey, is to say that people cannot, in the democratic process, in state legislatures or the federal legislature, that people can't make decisions for themselves through the democratic process about abortion. So Dobbs itself involved a restriction limiting abortion after a particular point in time, right? You couldn't draw the line at 21 weeks or that sort of thing. Judges were deciding how far along it should go. And that's what's wrong legally with that line, because it just pulls everything up to such a high level of generality, gives all the authority to the judges.
Yeah. And that's the point. Cardinal George of Chicago, of happy memory, was a great mentor to me. He was like Scalia in my life. And he used to complain about judges having too much authority in our society and judges deciding these high moral matters. I remember he used to say, like when the Obergefell thing was under consideration, he said, "I'm not so much for it or against it. The court should not be deliberating on that matter. The nature of marriage is not a matter for a court to decide. It's a matter of the natural law." So, but generally, he thought judges had too much authority to determine moral matters in our country.
Well, I think, let's see, if it's a free-floating thing, I do have to be careful not to express views, and Dobbs did not touch Obergefell. But I think what Cardinal George was reacting to is what we've been talking about, and the distinction between the approach to the Constitution that Dobbs took versus the approach that Roe took, which is putting decisions about what liberties are protected in the hands of judges rather than the democratic process.
I think that's right. And that's what was bothering him about it.
Yeah.
As Justice Barrett and Bishop Barron explained, abortion was never a right that the judicial system had the authority to create in the first place, because the killing of an innocent human being violates the natural law, and neither judges nor governments have the moral authority to take away the right to life. Because once courts claim the power to declare the killing of innocent human life a constitutional right, there is no principled limit to what judges could later justify or permit. Crucially, this concern was not something discovered only in hindsight, but was raised clearly and forcefully from the very beginning. It was articulated at that time by prominent Catholic voices, including Cardinal Francis George, who argued that the central issue was never simply whether Catholics personally supported or opposed abortion, but whether judges possessed any legitimate authority to resolve such a profound moral question at all. Which is precisely why the justices who voted to legalize abortion had to stretch and effectively manipulate the concept of the right to privacy in order to justify it, since no such right could be found in the Constitution itself. That reliance on an implied and unstable foundation is also the reason the decision ultimately collapsed, notwithstanding nearly 50 years of legal precedent and implementation. With that context in mind, Justice Barrett then turns in the next clip to a closely related issue, religious freedom and the establishment of religion, and reflects on tension between the two as they are embedded in the First Amendment. Let's listen.
I'm serving currently on the President's Commission on Religious Liberty, and we've been meeting a number of times. It's been interesting. And it's given me this kind of renewed sense of the importance of the First Amendment and that, you might say, tensive relationship between the non-establishment clause. There's no officially sanctioned, religion. We're not an Anglican society or a Catholic society or whatever. At the same time, the guarantee of the free exercise of religion. And the tension, it seems to me, opens up the right space to be in. Richard John Newhouse, who was a disciple in many ways of Courtney Murray, has that famous book, The Naked Public Square, which is going against the idea that the public space is denuded of religion. So he's against that. But by the same token, he was against what he called a sacred public square, whereby we have an officially sanctioned religion. What he wanted, he said, was the civil public square, a place where the religions felt free to come forward and to share their point of view and exercise their religion, publicly, and to have a conversation, a debate. And that's such an elusive goal, isn't it? I think we oscillate between the naked public square and if you're against that, you must be for theocracy. But it's the First Amendment, the genius of it in a way, that non-establishment but free exercise, and that's the space we should be in. I'm pontificating now.
Your
point of view on that.
You're describing it you're doing a great job describing it, because you're right. There is a tension, and it is difficult to figure out how you can hold these two things simultaneously. And a lot of the court's cases are trying to walk that line, but that is what we're trying to get at. If there were an established religion, then it would be very difficult to simultaneously guarantee freedom of religion,
right,
because there would be one voice with which the government was speaking.
Right.
So we can't have the established religion, otherwise you sacrifice the religious liberty. But by the same token, the religious liberty, it would become self-defeating if the logical end to it was to force everyone to see things your way, to try to turn America into a Catholic country, Christian country, Muslim country, what have you.
Right. The paradox to me is, from within my own Catholicism, I have a reverence for religious liberty. So as a Catholic, as well as an American, but as a Catholic, I respect human dignity to such a degree that I'm not going to impose my religion on anybody. I'm not going to compel you to believe. And so it's my very Catholicism that encourages me to be an advocate of religious liberty.
Well, which is also the teaching of the church, that we should respect religious liberty
Right.
and never force faith on anyone else.
We propose, we don't impose. Now, God, go back over our history. We're not always brilliant at that, but that's the ideal, that we don't impose but propose.
This is where Bishop Barron takes the argument further, explaining how the First Amendment closely mirrors the Catholic Church's own understanding of religious freedom. On one hand, the government must not interfere with religion. On the other hand, religion must not impose itself upon the government and turn political order into theocracy. This is precisely why, as Catholics, we are called to propose our teachings in the public square rather than rely on the power of the state to force conversions. Faith must always be a free response to truth, because coercing belief would violate the freedom of the human person and ultimately undermine human dignity. This is why Pope John Paul II could state so clearly that the Church does not impose the truth, she proposes it, trusting that truth, when offered freely, has its own power to persuade. That conviction is not a modern invention but runs deep in the Catholic tradition. St. Augustine ultimately taught that true faith requires interior assent and cannot be reduced to mere external compliance. No one believes unless he freely wills to believe. Thomas Aquinas built on this by explaining that faith is an act of the intellect moved by the will and therefore cannot be forced, since coercion can restrain actions but never produce genuine belief. This same insight later appears in the thought of St. John Henry Newman, who strongly opposed state coercion in religion and insisted that conscience must remain free because truth persuades by its own light, not by force. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.